All right, hello and welcome. It is the bottom of the hour on my clock, and we will get started very shortly here with today's webinar, The Plastic Problem and What We Can Do About It, with Rachel Salt. You don't have to take notes if you don't want to, because we will post the recording up on our website, greenteacher.com, tomorrow. And that will be free to view for the next 30 days, and anyone who has a subscription to Green Teacher will be able to view all of our webinars, which is coming up to about 120 recordings. So if you do have a subscription, you will be able to access those at all times while you have the subscription. In the spirit of looking for solutions and not problems, we are going to look at the plastic problem and what we can do about it, again, in the spirit of solutions-oriented thinking. That is the spirit with which we are presenting today's webinar. Rachel was connected to us through Firefly Books, through which she has published 2 books, and we review many of Firefly Books' resources in our quarterly magazine. So I'm your host, Ian Shanahan. I'm the general editor of Green Teacher. And if you're not familiar with Green Teacher, we are a global network of environmental educators, mainly based in North America. Our main offices are in southern Ontario, on the north shore of Lake Ontario. As I mentioned earlier, we have a quarterly magazine. Our next issue comes out spring equinox, so the last week of March. We also, over the last decade and a half, have produced numerous books. Proceeds from magazine subscriptions and the books all go back into the nonprofit. We've been a registered nonprofit in Canada since 1991. It is, in fact, this month our 30th anniversary. I was very young when Green Teacher started, as you can imagine. The 2 most recent books that we have produced are Teaching Kids About Climate Change and Teaching Teens About Climate Change. We were hoping to do a live book tour of these books this year, but we are now doing a virtual book tour, kind of like all the other book tours that are happening. So if you are with a school or organization that is interested in learning more about teaching kids and teaching teens about climate change and some of the activities that cover that topic in these 2 books, send me an email after this presentation or after the follow-up email that's sent out tomorrow, and we would be happy to arrange a complimentary virtual presentation of teaching kids and teaching teens about climate change, another very important issue that we are addressing in a lot of our work at Green Teacher. Last summer, we started a podcast. I know you might be thinking, oh goodness, not another podcast. Well, we decided to invest in proper equipment like a good microphone, such as the one that I'm using right now, and proper software, and we've been very pleased with the interest in the podcast, and as of last month, so the beginning of 2021, we have been able to use that familiar phrase, it is available wherever you get your podcasts. So yes, it's on iTunes and Spotify and all those other places. So Talking with Green Teachers, check it out. We talk with some interesting people about very interesting things in the vast field of environmental education. Episode number 6 is with a young 9-year-old artist who is taking the plastic pollution problem very seriously and has created her own coloring book. So you can check that out, again, wherever you get your podcasts, and hear about items and issues such as the plastic pollution problem. Who spreads the word about our webinars? You may have heard from some of these organizations. These are our Canadian webinar partners, and a big thanks to all of them for their support in spreading the word so that we can get our word out to as many people as possible. In addition to our webinar partners in Canada, we have many webinar partners also in the United States, many of them with state National Association of Environmental Education organizations. So thank you to all of our webinar partners for spreading the word, letting you know about upcoming webinars that we are doing in partnership with Green Learning, another EnviroEd organization. February 10th, so Wednesday next week at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, is all about a little known issue that probably shouldn't be as little known. It's about flooding and preparing and protecting your school from extreme weather events. That is next week. In fact, exactly a week from now, we will be doing that webinar in partnership with Green Learning. I jumped the gun before, but now I have my timing right. A little bit about our presenter this evening. Rachel Salt has published 2 books, as I mentioned, with Firefly Books. There's Your Plastic Footprint, the facts about plastic pollution and what you can do to reduce your footprint. and the plastic problem. Much of what is contained in these books will be part of today's presentation. Rachel also has a master's in environmental biology. She is based in Hamilton, Ontario, and we are very delighted to welcome Rachel virtually to the Green Teacher community and to all of you. So take it away, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Ian. I'm so excited to be sharing with you a little bit about my books, Your Plastic Footprint and the Plastic Problem. And I know a lot of you are teachers and educators, and I just want to say that I think teachers are the most important job in the whole world. So I'm very excited to be sharing with you, but a bit of a disclaimer. I have worked in science communication. I have worked in science clubs where I am presenting programs for science, and I have a little one, but I am not an educator. So I provided some ideas for lessons that you can incorporate and take what you like and leave what you don't. So, and another disclaimer while I'm on the disclaiming train is that though I am actively trying to reduce my plastic footprint and the waste that I contribute, I'm not zero waste, and I have a long way to get there. In fact, I actually really like plastic and admire plastic. So I wanted to start today by sharing some of my favorite plastic items. So this right here is a nesting set and squeaky nesting set of measuring cups that I found. I just think they are just so cool. And this here might look like a yogurt tub, but it's actually my son's favorite toy. And he loves to play with this. And the good thing is we can replace it when it gets a bit too mangled. And then the other item is what I'm wearing. So this sweater was my mom's, and she passed it down to me, and I really love it. And it's 100% acrylic, which is a plastic fiber. And 60% of all of our clothes are actually made from plastic fibers. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right into my presentation. So one amazing thing about plastic is it is really strong. You can use it for so many different types of materials and can stand this test of time. It's also really flexible. You can mold plastic into pretty much any shape that you like. It's long lasting, like these over 100-year-old pieces of plastic that are Bakelite, which is one of the first plastic, was the first plastic that was ever invented that was entirely synthetic. It is inexpensive, and it's also a sterile material. The problem is we use this super material that's super strong, super flexible for things that we might only use for a moment, like a plastic fork or a pill bottle, a water bottle, balloons, or a coffee cup. And this is known as single-use plastic. Now, I used to think if you took a plastic fork, you could just put it in your recycling bin, send it over to a plant, and then you would get a shiny new fork. And that plastic, that's how recycling worked. It was entirely recyclable. And that's not exactly how the process ends up. And though I still actively want to do the best job I can for recycling, and I see it as a great tool in reducing our waste, there are a lot of barriers to recycling, which I discuss in my book, and certain roadblocks, including how we collect it, how it's sorted, and the end market where we send our plastic waste to, and whether that exists or not. So ultimately, we only recycle worldwide about 9% of all plastic. It's not a common strategy here where I'm based in Canada, but about 12% of all plastic waste is incinerated worldwide. And this is a more common strategy in Europe and also in Japan. But ultimately, the rest of plastic lands in a landfill or the environment. So when it lands in the environment, it just doesn't stay static. Because it is buoyant and it can float, it can travel far and wide. So if I dropped a rubber ducky in the Hamilton Harbor in Lake Ontario, it could make its way all the way over to the UK. It sounds hard to believe, but this actually happened in a very accidental experiment involving rubber ducks. So every year, shipping containers fall overboard. An average of 350 shipping containers go overboard every year. And a lot of items have been lost at sea, including 3 million Lego, 34,000 hockey gloves, and 50,000 Nike shoes. And also a whole bunch, 28,000 bathtub toys. So there are things like in one shipping container on its way to Tacoma, Washington, there were red beavers, green frogs, and blue turtles, but mostly yellow rubber ducks. And so when they landed overboard, where they ended up was pretty surprising. Several months later, a whole bunch of them ended up in Alaska, but then over time, some of them made their way to Indonesia. Oh, some even made their way to Japan. Some traveled through ice floes in the Bering Strait and made their way to Atlantic Canada. So from this example, you could build some interesting lessons for your classroom, whether that is at home with one person or with a larger class, and talking with topics of buoyancy, ocean gyres, which is how water cycles in the ocean. And that leads to what is also called our plastic garbage patches that are in certain areas where there's large patches of garbage that aggregate based on ocean currents. We can also have discussions about drift ice and even shipping containers and how goods travel from place to place, and ways that you could create better design, and you could even implement a design challenge. But once plastic lands in our ocean, it just doesn't have any impact. It does have an impact on life. So plastic can be involved in entanglement. It can be ingested, like this puffin who you see, he or she has a fish in their mouth, but also a whole bunch of plastic, because sometimes plastic can actually look like food. When it's laying on a coral reef, it can leach out toxins. And there's also a lot of pollution involved in the production of plastic, because as many of you might know, 99% of all plastic comes from fossil fuel. So the extraction of that fuel and the transport of that fuel has a level of pollution as well. So this can make you feel kind of overwhelmed with a big problem, and it has huge impact. So it can feel kind of overwhelming. You might even feel like, what can I do to make an impact? But your contributions really can make a difference. One thing to think of is that every piece counts. So whether you are organizing a waste cleanup, you're bringing a reusable cup instead of a single-use one, or you're sharing items that you have like toys instead of building brand new, you're reducing the amount of waste you're contributing to the global trash pile. And your contributions really stack up over time. In my book, I look at examples for lifetime uses of plastic. For example, spread out over a lifetime, the average American will use 25,500 plastic bags. That's a huge amount of plastic. But if one day you decide, oh, I'm going to take a reusable bag, all of a sudden you begin to see that over time, these choices really stack up. Also, the really good news is people like you and people all around the world really care about pollution. So in 2018, Collins Dictionary said that single use was the word of the year. People were really tuning into the idea of plastic pollution. And so a tool I really like to use, and this is maybe something that you like to use as well, is looking at Google Trends. So you can take any kind of search term into Google Trends, like single-use plastic, and you can see how people have been talking about it online over time. So this graph shows you from 2004 all the way to current day. And it really piques interest around September 2019. And you see that it does dip down. Maybe some stuff has happened since 2019 in September. But as you can see, in this period of time, people are still talking about it more than they were over the course of 15 years. So even though we have been handling such global stress and adversity, people still care about plastic and are interested in plastic in a way that they weren't before, which is amazing. And there are solutions that exist and you can be part of them. So there's a lot of solutions, but I wanted to focus them on 3 areas this evening for ideas that you can pass on to other people. That's about learning a lot about plastic. If we learn about plastic, we can appreciate it and have a better understanding of how to build solutions to problems. And then I'm going to investigate some large scale solutions, as well as some smaller scale ones that are more individual based. It's a polymer, and polymers exist all over the world. So, and I mean, they're all over the world, of course, but they are in so many different things. Our DNA is a polymer. It's a repeating sequence of the same thing over and over again. So a way, depending on the age group you're discussing this with, a polymer could look like a chain sequence of paper clips or a paper chain. And then something else that is really fun and that is really satisfying to play with, and maybe some maybe some parents in the audience or even teachers are a bit sick of this, but it's slime, which is a cross-linked polymer that you can learn a little bit more about how you take glue, which is a polymer, and then by adding in a reactant, it will make for a super strong, super connected polymer. Slime, it's very cool. Another thing that could be a great activity you could do is by looking at how much plastic you use in a single day. So one morning I woke up and I decided I want to see everything I touch in the morning, and I didn't repeat anything. So like if I touched a cup more than once, it only counted as one activity. But I wanted to see in the first 20 minutes of my morning, how many pieces of plastic did I touch? And I found that there was, what does it say right there? It looks like 36 pieces of plastic just in my morning. So, and you could ask your students or yourself, what are some things that really surprised you? What were some things that you're like, oh, actually, I don't know if this is plastic. It might be. So another thing is looking for resin codes. So resin codes are all at the bottom of a plastic container. So for example, I see this one has a number 3 on it. And so that is made of PVC, polyvinyl chloride plastic. So one time when we're talking about plastic, we'll often say it's made of plastic, but there's actually hundreds of types of different plastic. And we label them in our recycling system here in North America just to be 7. So that's something you can talk about, is organizing these pieces of plastic and thinking, what are some things that are similar? What are some things that are different? What are things that are labeled as the number 7 plastic? What makes it an other? And from that idea, you can start to think of some pros of certain types of plastic and some cons. What if there was one unifying super plastic? It could have a lot of interesting conversations, and it's interesting to see what has a code and then what doesn't have a code. What's the purpose of the code? How does it help with recycling? There's a lot of good exploration and questions from that. So moving into large scale solutions, I'm going to cover 3 topics. One is plastic reimagined. So those are different types of plastic alternative material. I'll talk about corporate responsibility. And also I would like to talk about cleanups. So biodegradable plastic is a really interesting idea. So it's the idea that plastic can break down. So currently it will take a regular plastic like this PVC bottle, almost 1,000 years it is hypothesized to break down over time. But this scale shows that this type of biodegradable plastic can break down over the course of 73 days, which is pretty amazing. But some problems you run into with biodegradable plastics is they're all different. There's so many different types, and a lot of them require really specific conditions, such as specific moisture, oxygen, a certain level of microorganisms, a specific pH and temperature. So a lot of facilities and waste facilities throughout the world might not have the capabilities to actually break down that type of plastic. So it might sit in a landfill similar to traditional fossil fuel-based plastic. Also, there's a misconception that all biodegradable plastic is also a bioplastic. There are bioplastics that are made from biological materials such as corn, but then there are also fossil fuel-based plastics that have additives put in them that will help them biodegrade. But it's still a really interesting area that can have a lot of potential for discovery. So it's something I wanted to share with some really cool ideas that have come forward. So this is a picture of shrimp, and using proteins found in their exoskeleton, they made some really cool plastic. Inventors have made some really cool plastic that they have named Shrilk. And also, so exoskeleton can be of insects as well, but they've named it Shrilk after the shrimp. So when we look at a mushroom, the big, beautiful mushroom that pops out, that's actually the fruiting body of that, but then has like a root. It's not exactly a root system because mushrooms aren't plants, but it's called mycelium, which is it's essentially similar to a plant's rooting system. So one company, Ecovative Design, came up with this really cool idea of using mushrooms to actually grow containers. So have a mushroom grow within a mold, then have it dried out over time, and then you get a really wonderful container that can transport goods in a safe way, but it's made from mycelium. And these are called from a brand called Notpla. They're made from seaweed, and they are little pouches for different sauces, but the container is entirely edible. So as mentioned, I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and one of the biggest events that happens in non-COVID time in Hamilton, Ontario is called the Around the Bay Race, and they proudly say it's older than the Boston Marathon. So it's a couple of years older than the Boston Marathon. And typically you get around 10,000 participants in this race. And over the course of this race, there's a water station every 5 kilometers. So it's a 30-kilometer race, 6 water stations. So potentially there's 60,000 cups headed to the landfill. But what does this have to do with plastic? You might be thinking. So there's actually a lot of hidden plastic in our cups. So if you want to, as an experiment, if you have a coffee cup that you had as a takeout coffee, or even some ice cream in an ice cream container, if you soak that in hot water, or even just a tub of cold water overnight, you'll begin to be able to peel the layer of plastic that's on the inside that keeps the cup waterproof. So that's a reason why a lot of paper cups are not recyclable. But even still, even if these paper cups were only made of paper, it's still a lot of waste. That's a Starbucks cup with the inside removed. So as a design challenge, you could have your classroom pitch an idea of an alternative for how they are going to distribute water for this race. This is an idea that they could pitch to the mayor. We want to make the city of Hamilton, or wherever city you live, proud. Also, it wants to be a sort of thing that is accessible to runners, so that they are getting that they can actually drink it on the go. And then you also would want to have it a good design in terms of the environment, because sometimes you want to have a plastic alternative, but it might not actually, sometimes alternatives you have to think critically about if it's going to also have some issues in other ways as well. I also see that the closed caption stopped sometime along the way, so I'm sorry about that. And also says there's microphone issues. So I hope you're all hearing me all right, and I apologize if there's some issues there. So I'm going to move on to our next topic, which is around corporate responsibility. So I do want to share that individuals have a huge impact on waste. We can really make a difference, and the changes we make, I really do believe they do stack up over time. That being said, corporations have a much larger responsibility than our individual waste when it comes to their global amount of trash that is put into our environment. For example, 71% of all industrial emissions come from just 100 energy companies. And also, you might want to be really trying to reduce your waste, but then you want to feed yourself or you want to clothe yourself, And when you go to the store, sometimes the infrastructure isn't set up in a way that is accessible to you. So one lesson I think that is an important one that can be shared is investigating corporate responsibility and how certain brands contribute to the global trash pile. So reports reveal there's massive plastic pollution footprint from drink firms. A report says plastic from Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Nestle, Unilever products could cover 83 football pitches every day. So I think this is a Guardian article, so I'm going to translate football pitches to be soccer fields. So that is a whole lot of plastic every day brought on by just a few companies just from drinking bottles. So something you can look at with your students or with yourself is start to investigate marketing around ads. And part of that could be looking at greenwashing. When you look at this ad, what does every drop is green mean? And then also start to look at how an ad might shift responsibility from the corporation to the individual. So for example, in this Tim Hortons ad, it says, help us save tons of cups by choosing a Tim Hortons coffee sleeve over a double cup. So now they're saying they're going to change the amount of waste that's being put in by your individual choice by not taking a double cup. So that's just a transfer of responsibility via this ad. And that's a strategy that has been used now for decades. So this is an ad from the Keep America Beautiful campaign. And so this campaign has a man who is crying, and he's represented as an Indigenous person. He's actually a non-Indigenous actor. And so the single tear is an iconic image from the 70s of him crying over litter. But the Keep America Beautiful campaign was actually brought together by a huge lobbying group that also included PepsiCo and Dixie Cups and a couple of other organizations. So it really changes the responsibility. At the time in the 50s, when this board came together, there was a huge uptick in the amount of plastic pollution being produced. And so a lot of people were calling for more responsibility put on corporations for the amount that they outputted into the environment. So this kind of ad campaign successfully shifts the responsibility onto our individual actions. And I will repeat that I think our actions do really matter, but it's important to also assess the responsibility of organizations at that level. And there's a lot of cool ways that you can do as an individual or as a classroom can hold power to account. This is a really interesting campaign with the hashtag is this yours, where if you find some litter on the ground and you see that it's labeled, for example, as Astro, you can tag that brand Astro and be like, hey, is this yours? And then the idea is to shift some of the ownership onto corporations for the waste that they are creating. So there's some also amazing innovations when it comes to cleanups. So I was talking earlier about a plastic garbage patch. It's the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's the largest one. And I believe the total amount of garbage in the patch, in the area where it's most centralized, is 3 times bigger than the country of France. So that's a huge, huge amount. But when you look at the ocean, it looks beautiful. It's blue. And when you think of a patch, you might think of this giant island of trash. It's not really like that. It's more like a soup of trash. So what they've done is created this technique to aggregate this trash and kind of corral it together, and it has a skirt that is several meters long that can get some of the trash that is in the intermediate way. So that's one really cool technology. Another really interesting idea comes from the Baltimore Harbor. This is Mr. Trash Wheel. Mr. Trash Wheel and their accompanying friend, Professor Trash Wheel, together have collected 999 tons of trash since May of 2014. And that stat is when my book was published in 2019. So since that point, I imagine they've collected a lot more trash. And this is a really cool process where it's powered solarly and uses the currents of the harbor and this sort of water wheel process. And the design is pretty cool. That's a design that you could maybe investigate and see, maybe you could build a model of that. There might also exist designs for how to build your own model of Mr. Trash Wheel. Also, imagine if there was a Mr. Trash Wheel in every harbor, if you could kind of calculate that out, the impact that could have in terms of collecting waste. So another really, really cool project is called sea bins, which I think of essentially as just like a garbage bin that's in the harbor where water flows in through and then it goes through a mesh where the plastic can land, and it's a thin enough mesh that you can also collect microplastics. So microplastic's not something I talked about yet, but it's a huge issue because, well, it's really, really small, which makes it really, really hard to clean up. But it's also small enough that very small microorganisms can eat it, and it can build its way up into the food chain where it can have a large bioaccumulative effect. So worldwide, there are now 860 sea bins that capture 3,612 kilograms a day of plastic. I think that's fascinating. So maybe in your classroom or at home, you can start to think of your own plastic design cleanup strategy and what you could do. So I've included in my list of resources, this is, I forget the name of the organization, but it's included in my PDF. You can take a look and it sets you up for a great lesson plan on how to do this kind of activity. You don't need a full inflatable pool. You could do it in a smaller scale, and it's a great way to get creative, and it can bring up a lot of cool questions. So something else that you can do either as an individual or at a larger scale is a cleanup. So the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup is a very interesting event. It's interesting, but it's also great. It's the Great Canadian Shoreline Cleanup. All right, I'll stop. So this event right now has been modified with current conditions, but you can do a cleanup socially distanced. And they've also included on their website guidelines on how to organize a solo household or a small team cleanup. So that's something that you might want to consider and something that students could do on their own. I think it's really a great idea to document what you found and notice certain types of plastic. Are you finding a lot of cigarette butts? Are you finding a lot of bottles? Is there one particular brand that keeps coming up? So one study I read about recently that was really cool that came out of the University of Guelph was there's been an increase of PPE waste, so personal protective. What's the E stand for? Okay, anyway, it's masks and gloves, etc. So there's a big increase in that type of waste. So what they would go out every day and collect that waste. But it made me think that it would be a great project to learn how to do a survey of that type. If you had a set area, if you knew the measurements of your neighborhood park or soccer field, and if you were able to take waste from that every day, you could see how much waste there is per area. So that's a really cool way of teaching a lesson on how scientists often will collect data. And you can extend this beyond collecting waste outside, but start to really measure the waste that you have at your home, at your office, in your classroom, wherever you are. So I would really recommend doing a personal waste audit if you are interested in reducing your waste, because it can help you realize the parts of your life where you are collecting a lot of waste on a regular basis. And if you can measure something, you can manage it. And then you can take that information and then reflect back to it and be like, oh, wow, I've made a lot of changes since then. And my amount of waste that I'm putting into the global landfill is really starting to go down. So for example, if you used a certain number of straws in a week or takeout containers you can multiply that out to over the course of the year. And that will start to really help you realize the types of waste that you're putting out into the world, but also the volume, how it really stacks up over time. Because one of the reasons I think people often will put a lot of waste out into the world is, well, because there's a lot of infrastructure problems and a lot of the stuff that we need is wrapped in plastic. But the other thing is, it's out of sight, out of mind. We put our trash on the curb, many of us, every week, and then someone else deals with it. So we don't really have to visualize the kind of trash we are creating. Another way you could do this is by volume and weight. So if you have a known container, you can measure the length, width, and height, and you could weigh it empty and then weigh it when it's full. And from that point, you will see how long it takes you to fill up that volume of waste. So that will just give you a number instead of the items of waste, of volume and a weight of the amount of plastic you are creating. So you could display this in any way. You could put all your plastic waste in a jar or a container, or you could wear it. So this is a really great video. So the section of the video I took a little bit for the polymer comes from this larger video. I included a link for it in the resources, so check it out. It's by ASAP Science, and where they wear their waste for a week. So everything that they create in terms of trash, they wear that on their shirt, which is a really cool way of visualizing the waste that it stacks up over time. So I'm going to move on to small scale solutions. So you might have heard of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. I like to refer to the 6 R's. So reduce, reuse, recycle, rethink, repair, and refuse. So I really want to focus on rethink, because I think if we can rethink how we feel about plastic, if we don't feel plastic as just trash, if we change our relationship with plastic, it can change the amount of waste we put out into the world. So this is a really cool video where the artist Shadi Rabab has helped students create musical instruments all from found pieces of trash. So check that out. It's a really great song, and those kids are really, really talented. So this is, I didn't put her name up here. Wow, that was a silly thing to do. Michaela Pedros is making furniture from scrap wood. So by finding scrap wood in plastic bottles, so by taking bottles that she found on the street, she was able to heat the plastic and bind 2 pieces of wood together to form an extra strong and stable joint. So that's really interesting. And she has a video that I've also included of her sitting on them, and you see they're really, really strong. And so just an interesting way of thinking of plastic as a building material. And plastic this is all bottle caps. You could have some really interesting designs and art that is functional or not when it comes to plastic. So a website and organization I find really cool, and I'd really like to try some of their stuff on my own, but is called Precious Plastic. So they have a whole community of people who are involved in precious plastic, and it's with the idea of really trying to change the idea of plastic into something that is precious. So there's a whole different bunch of workshops that you can do, whether that be collecting it or having a shredding workspace or having an extrusion workspace where you melt the plastic and extrude it out through an extruder. And there's also injection molds. So all of these inventions that they have are free to use. They put out all the designs for free. If you are so inclined and able to do that, that's something that's a much bigger project, maybe something you could do as a whole school potentially, and something that you'd want to invest in. They also sell these different parts of machines, and then they have a map of where there are workshops all around the world that are involved in this process. And they have a whole bunch of activities and learning guides, and it's a really great resource. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. So back to my son's favorite toy, the yogurt tub, you know, it can be a bigger project like precious plastic where you start, you know, melting down all your plastic waste and creating your own recycling business, or you could build a really great toy for your kids that helps them with their fine motor skills. You could have a really fun craft, a flower pot. You could turn a yogurt tub into an embroidery hoop by cutting off the bottom. Now you have a great embroidery hoop. You could take your plastic tub to the beach, and great, now you can build awesome sandcastles. So another great resource I wanted to point out is the U of T trash team. So they have some awesome ideas for crafts, but also lesson plans, which they lay out really well in a PDF. For example, this one is using a pasta box to turn it into an animal mask. And then they give a list of materials and instructions. So I've included a link to their website, and it goes beyond just crafts. They have a whole bunch of different lesson plans, some that involve how plastic flows up the food web. So they have a lot of great resources on how to create and follow through on a waste audit that I would definitely recommend checking out. So my book, Your Plastic Footprint, really goes into more detail about how plastic waste stacks up over time and looks at, investigates the different elements of pollution, both from single-use plastic to lifetime-use plastic, for example, or the things that are mid-use plastic, I would call like your clothes that you wear. And the plastic problem, my first book, is designed more for ages 9 to 13, but it's honestly a great resource for anyone who is really interested in a plastic 101. And I chalked both of these books with lots of resources. You can check them out at your local library. If they don't have them, you can ask them to carry it. You can contact your local bookstore to see if they'd be willing to carry the book, if that's a place you'd like to purchase it. And then when you've read it and you've done it, pass it on to someone. So the more people who can learn about plastic waste, I think the better, because I really think it is a problem that is within our grasp, but it's going to take a lot of creativity and it's going to take a lot of people being involved. So thank you so much.
So question number 1 in the chat box. What are some other ways, I know you touched on this somewhat, but what are other ways that individuals can hold corporations responsible? I mean, certainly speaking with our dollar is one of the ways in sending those market signals. Anything else beyond that you would recommend?
That's a great question. It's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I think often the best thing to do in terms of holding power to account is thinking about your own personal skill sets. So if you are an artist, how can you use your art to get that message out about the amount of waste that is being created by Nestle, for example? If you are a great organizer and a community-minded person, could you organize an event that is protesting a certain corporation that you think has unfair or unenvironmental practices? If you're an amazing writer, letter writing is really impactful. Social media posts have an impact, but writing your MP, your MPP, or your governor, or I saw a lot of people from the States as well, or your senator, like that has a real impact. If you're a strong writer in organizing this en masse with a bunch of people, that has a huge impact as well. That's a great question, but I will, if I find some resource, I'm sure there's some people in the chat box right now who have awesome ideas around organizing and holding power to account. But as Ian said, definitely using your dollar can have a huge impact. And also, if you have relationships with your grocer, you can have conversations if they would be interested in selling goods that have less packaging. So that's something that you can do as well. I've also seen people where they take what they are going to purchase and they remove all the plastic from that packaging within the store and leave it there, so that the responsibility is now not on the individual, but the wholesaler and also the corporation to deal with that. So that is one idea.
And on a similar vein, we have a question about holding grocery stores accountable, and we actually were dealing with that and had a statement put out by our local grocery store just a few days ago. So, anything that you would recommend specific to grocery stores and food packaging?
Yeah, that is a great idea. A great question is, yeah, something I've been thinking about too. So I did just mention that idea around leaving the waste behind for your groceries. That's something that could be organized as an event. Similarly, you can contact the big corporations that often grocers are under. For example, in Canada, Loblaws is a huge company, and you could voice your opinion that way. Um, there's also a lot of rules around, or there's a lot. So once you start thinking about plastic waste, you see how it's also really tied to so many other things as well. And there's astronomical amount of food at grocery stores that are thrown away. So, and that is a huge amount of food waste, but it's also a huge amount of plastic waste. So that is another way that you can reach out to corporations, but also to your government to make sure that those corporations are more accountable. I know in France, for example, there are laws about what kind of food can be thrown away. So if there is pressure from your government onto corporations, you can hold your government to do that job and help do that work in partnership with you. So I think I think that's a partial answer, but these are ideas I'm thinking about a lot. And that's a great question.
For sure. There was a question specifically about the sea bins and what measures are in place to ensure that life forms and living creatures don't get caught as well in the sea bins.
Yeah, that's a great question. For the sea bins, they have, in particular, they are raised, and the top part where the water's flowing has, so with the intent for that organisms can't go in. But I am certain that it's not entirely foolproof. And I know that is also a large criticism of the ocean cleanup project as well, that it doesn't consider, it has some barriers in terms of protecting wildlife. So that's a great way, a conversation to have with your students as well, in terms of, for all these different solutions, there's often a lot of, potential barriers involved, or things that definitely need to be worked out. So those are important to acknowledge. Anytime you're trying to come up with a solution, it's important to be critical about them as well. But there's more information about the sea bins online, for sure.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, being critical about solutions is so key. And Laura's put in a note that food waste creates so much methane gas. And I know in the response that
Okay.
our local grocery store put out was that for the purpose of keeping certain food fresh, they have to use plastic, or they feel like that's one of the only options so that there is less food waste. And obviously, we know methane is so much more powerful of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So the, there is certainly no easy solution, and a really important point, both about the sea bins and about the food waste creating the methane gas. One teacher writing in that her students are really focused on the waste issue and reducing litter, but what is an approach to a long-term solution? I mean, doing a class, a schoolyard cleanup is certainly great and can be very impactful, but what's something that goes beyond just we cleaned up the schoolyard today, but in a few weeks it's back to square one?
That's an awesome question, because a lot of the also criticism of focusing energy on cleanup strategies to begin with is it doesn't turn off the tap. There's a whole bunch of plastic that's in the environment, but you have to turn off the tap in terms of production. So I know, even despite, so this is more of maybe a more negative idea and story, but even though there's so much interest in reducing plastic lobbyists are eager to increase plastic production throughout the world. And it's actually expected to rise and not necessarily go down, especially as the oil and gas sector begins to lose money because more people are leaving the more fossil fuel based vehicles. They're putting more energy into plastic. Off topic. Okay, So in terms of keeping a longer strategy, a lot of it can be around, thinking about those 3 R's at your classroom. How can you actually reduce waste that you're creating? And one thing is like just thinking about what you need. Like a lot of stuff is there's a lot of stuff around like what's the alternative thing that I can buy. Often you don't need to buy anything to reduce your waste. You can just start thinking. So if there's something that you want to get, if whether it be an outfit or a new kitchen appliance, think about it for 30 days. Think about, do you still want it then? Is there a way you could borrow it from someone? Is there something you can share? As a classroom, is there, can people bring in a kit to help them reduce waste in their day-to-day if they always have their cutlery at school? Is that something that they can do? As soon as you leave the door, if you have a kit with you ready to go with your reusable items, you don't have to really think about it, and it gets built into your routine. And then over time, you're going to start really seeing that you are reducing your waste. So I think that's a great question. And it needs to, yeah, for sure extend. It feels good to do a cleanup, but you really want to build it into your whole life and what you're thinking about. So that's a great question.
Another question, a bit more long-winded in terms of using the plastic that's used in drink bottles for upcycling and reusing is fairly commonly done because it's very strong. However, adding dirt, glue, paint, etc. can make these unrecyclable later. So the question from that is there a movement to push for reuse of the other types of plastic which are not easily recycled?
That's a great question. Yeah. You're absolutely correct. So often drinking bottles is made of high density polyethylene, or is made of PET, which is another type of plastic. And forget the acronym right now. But you're right, those are both very strong plastics. And then some of the other ones like polystyrene that you find for some different containers, and also classically styrofoam, they're much more difficult um, to recycle. But I would like to say that even PET, which is a more highly recyclable plastic, you can really only recycle it 2 to 3 times before it begins to really break down its integrity. So every time you recycle it, that polymer chain that it's made of gets fewer and fewer and fewer links. So you ultimately will have to turn it in, not back into the container that it was, but it will be turned into a lower grade kind of plastic, maybe something that's used for a playground tarmac sort of thing. So that's important. But I think a lot of scientists are actually looking at the idea of around one super plastic, because one of the big barriers of recycling to begin with is there's so many different types. But if there was one super plastic, could that be a potential? That solution could also, have its own set of problems, but that is increasing the recyclability of plastics is definitely something that is being considered. And that's something that corporations want to have as a possibility too, because if they can advertise their stuff as 100% recyclable, or if they can start, creating a loop system where their products are put back in, that could really be a good thing. Good thing for corporations and good thing for the environment potentially.
And speaking of corporations and organizations, do you have a list of any, and maybe this could be included in the resource pack, but a list of any that you would direct students towards, organizations that are doing a lot to reduce their plastic use and other green initiatives?
Oh, that's a great question. I should really write that down as a list. But offhand, there isn't like a definite list that I have, but I would definitely recommend people check out that Precious Plastic website. I find it very, very interesting. There's an organization called Loop, which is, I think, now making its way to Ontario, and where it's the idea that it's a milkman model of getting goods. So if you wanted to have your detergent every month, it would be delivered to you in a bottle, and then when you were done with it, it would be taken away and refilled. So that's a kind of cool process, and a lot of businesses have signed on to be a part of it in corporations. So that's a model that could really have an impact. I think that could be scalable for sure. But I will think on that, and I can send an email to Ian.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll include that in everything that goes out tomorrow. And again, we'll have the recording of this up on our website tomorrow, and that will be free to view for anybody. And then subscribers to Green Teacher will be able to view that and all of our webinars as long as they have a subscription. We have just come to about the 60-minute mark, so we will officially wrap up there. But if there are any additional final questions, you're most certainly welcome to stick around. Most importantly, though, I must thank Rachel Salt for delivering an inspiring set of very important information for an issue that probably, it gets a lot of press. It probably doesn't get as much press as it should get. And your efforts, Rachel, this evening in sharing this information will help us spread the word to students and beyond, and hopefully have a generation of students who go on to be plastic responsible adults, certainly in terms of how they use plastic. So thank you to Firefly for connecting us, and thank you, Rachel, for sharing your words of wisdom today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.